This is revision session 1 for the Weimar and Nazi Germany unit. I'm going to break this into 4 sections. This will be the first section today. I'll be taking you from the early days of the Weimar Republic through to the Weimar Constitution, strengths and weaknesses. It's the early unpopularity of the Weimar Republic, the unrest that they faced, particularly in 1923 when the Weimar Republic refused to pay reparations and faced hyperinflation following the French invasion of the Ruhr. Then we'll look at some of the changes, cultural changes and economic changes that happened under the Weimar Republic, like improved living standards for the working class and more freedom for women and things like that. Okay, so that's what we're looking at in this session. Try and keep it to less than 20 minutes if possible. First of all, the war was really devastating for Germany. There'd been a naval blockade throughout World War I. That means that German ports had been prevented from receiving any imports. So the German people were starving by the end of World War I. About 750 people died as a result of those blockades. This meant that Kaiser Wilhelm was just unable to continue at the head of the country. He was forced to step down because people were just sick of the war. The soldiers were okay as you can be fighting in the trenches, but the ordinary people back in German cities and towns were starving and they'd had enough. And you know what happens when the country is impoverished? People are pushed to the extremes, and in this sense the extreme was getting rid of the Kaiser. So his position was untenable. This is underlined by, in November 1918, members of the German Navy rebelled and refused to board their ships. Okay, this is known as the Kiel Mutiny, and they refused to do as they were told. So even the Navy is refusing to do as it's told. In Hanover, a German city, German troops refused to control the rioters, so even the army is refusing to do as it's told. And then a Jewish communist called Kurt Eisner encouraged a mass strike in Munich. Okay, so in Munich you've got the Eisner strike. So these are all examples of how devastating the war was for Germany. This turned into revolution. Okay, by November 1918, the Kaiser Wilhelm was forced to abdicate. That's the key word. On the 9th of November 1918, and this created a power vacuum. There was so much civil unrest, so much fighting on the streets, that Kaiser Wilhelm was forced to step down, and this created a power vacuum. Okay, so who steps in? Who leads Germany? Nobody had an answer to that. So we had a temporary government. Okay, temporary government stepped in. The Social Democratic Party stepped in. The SPD, with the Council of People's Representatives. And it was them that organised the moves for an election for a proper, full-time, permanent Republican government. Now, a republic is government without a king, without a monarch, in this case, without Kaiser Wilhelm. Okay? So, 11th of November, there was a ceasefire. The World War was ended by that temporary government. So they were known as the November criminals by the army. They were blamed for ending World War I because they were the men that signed the armistice. Okay? They had no choice in reality. They had to stop fighting. There was just nowhere for the army to go. They were being beaten in the trenches. America had just joined the war towards the end of 1917 with fresh troops. There was no way that Germany could win. So they had no choice but to sign the armistice and eventually sign the Treaty of Versailles. But because it was them that did it and not the Kaiser, because it was this Republican government, they were known as the November criminals. They were the ones that got blamed for it. Okay, so key words you need. You need Friedrich Ebert. He was the first president, temporary president of the Weimar Republic. Eventually became permanent when he was elected, and he was the head of the Social Democratic Party, also known as the SPD. Okay, and he set up elections for the Reichstag, which took place in January 1919. Okay, so you need to be aware of all the unrest that happened, all the civil unrest as a result of World War One that brought about the end of Kaiser Wilhelm's reign and the rise of Ebert's Social Democratic Party. Okay? So, the Weimar Republic, next section. The Weimar Republic, what were the strengths and weaknesses of the Weimar Republic? First of all, the Council of People's Representatives was the temporary organisation. They set up elections in January 1919 to create a new Reichstag. It was democratic. Women could vote. This was a great big step forward, much more advanced than even Britain was at the time. Okay, Friedrich Ebert became the first president. He was a leader of the SPD, as we've said. And the members of the new Reichstag met in Weimar. It was just too dangerous in Berlin, so that's why it's called the Weimar Republic. Now, the Weimar Republic needed a rule book, a constitution that said how they would govern the country. Okay, so now we get the Weimar Constitution set up. And the Weimar Constitution, or rule book, has strengths and weaknesses. Okay, first of all, a strength. Let's do the strengths first. It was very democratic. Okay, every adult could vote, which, as I said, was more democratic than Britain at the time. Okay, you've got the president at the head of the government. He's the number one politician in the country, and he's elected every 7 years. And the president chooses the chancellor. Okay, the president is also the head of the army, so he's enormously powerful. Soldiers swear an oath of allegiance to the president. Okay. And the president can dissolve the Reichstag and call new elections if there's a problem. If legislation or laws are not being passed quickly enough, the president can dissolve the Reichstag. Okay. Directly elected by the German people, as I've said, so has a mandate to rule. And the parties, the political parties, are also elected to something called the Reichstag, which is quite similar to our Houses of Parliament. There are two houses, just like in our Parliament. You've got the Reichstag, which is like the House of Commons, and the Reichsrat, which is a little bit like the House of Lords. It's less powerful and consists of regional representatives. So we've got the Reichstag and the Reichsrat. Members are elected every 4 years using a very democratic system of election called proportional representation. Now, that's a key word. You need to know that, okay? Proportional representation. On the one hand, it's very fair proportional representation. Everybody's vote counts, okay? You can look into it. You can Google it, find out a little bit more about proportional representation and why it was so democratic, but just take it from me, for the purposes of this revision session, that it was very democratic. Okay, everybody's vote counts. It's very fair. Even small political parties received seats in the Reichstag because of proportional representation. Okay? So, they're the strengths. Very democratic, women are allowed to vote, strong president, and uses a very fair system of election called proportional representation. However, the Constitution also had weaknesses. Now, I'll go back to proportional representation. Yes, it's very democratic, but proportional representation also leads to coalition governments. Now, coalition governments are notoriously weak because they're made up of lots of different parties. Those parties can't agree on things, so you end up getting lots of arguments, and legislation or laws don't get passed. Okay, so coalition governments was a big problem in the German system. Okay, very democratic, but coalition governments meant that they were quite weak governments. Okay, another weakness with the Weimar Constitution was Article 48. This was the rule by which the president could suspend the Constitution and pass laws without even consulting the Reichstag. Okay, so you've got to think of the Weimar system as having the president at the top, but the president kind of has to do what the Reichstag agrees, except if the president decides to suspend the Reichstag and invoke Article 48 and just do as he pleases. So the problem with Article 48 is it was like this get-out clause for democracy that meant the president could just become a dictator if he wanted to. Okay, that's kind of a good thing in some ways because it meant that laws could be passed if in an emergency, but as we'll see, Adolf Hitler kind of uses that preference for Article 48 to kind of demand emergency powers in a few years' time, later down the line. But for now, in the early years of the Weimar Republic, it was a safety valve. Okay, so you've got strengths and weaknesses of the Weimar Republic, and you need to know them. Proportional representation, women being allowed to vote, strong president, they're all strengths. But the weaknesses, Article 48, and proportional representation leading to weak coalition governments. Okay, now, moving on again. The early unpopularity of the Weimar Republic, well, the obvious one is that they were known as the November criminals. They were blamed for signing the armistice that ended the war. Okay, so that's one big fat reason why the Weimar Republic was massively unpopular with its people. Okay, the second reason they were massively unpopular is because they also signed the Treaty of Versailles. So Friedrich Ebert's government, the SPD, signed not only the armistice but also the Treaty of Versailles. Okay. The terms of the Treaty of Versailles were massively unfair against Germany. They were really punished for starting World War One, and we can go into that in a little bit more detail now. Okay, so the Treaty of Versailles was incredibly harsh. David Lloyd George was the Prime Minister of Britain, and George Clemenceau was the President of France, and Woodrow Wilson was the President of the USA. And these were known as the Big Three at the Treaty of Versailles. Know them. Use their surnames. You don't need both names, but you need their surnames. Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Wilson. Okay, Germany wasn't even invited to send a representative to be involved in the discussions. They had no say in what the Treaty of Versailles terms were. Okay, so that's the first reason that it was hated by the German people. It was what was called their diktat. D-I-K-T-A-T. D-I-K-T-A-T, a diktat. It was dictated to them. They had no say in it. Okay, and then we've got four categories of reasons why the Treaty of Versailles was so unpopular. The first one being the war guilt clause. This was another thing that really upset the German people. They were forced to admit that they started the war, to say that they were to blame for it. Okay, the war guilt clause, also known as Article 231. Okay, not to be confused with Article 48. Remember, that has to do with the Weimar Constitution. This is Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, the war guilt clause. So that's one area that was really unpopular. The second area was with the military. Okay, Germany's army was reduced to 100,000 men. They weren't allowed any tanks. They weren't allowed any submarines or aircraft, and they could only have 6 warships and 15,000 sailors. Okay, so the military was reduced. Also, part of that was an area in Germany called the Rhineland was demilitarized. This is like a buffer zone between France and Germany. The Rhineland was demilitarized. No soldiers allowed in there at all. Not now. Okay. Also, financially, Germany was forced to pay £6.6 billion. £6.6 billion in what was called reparations. Okay, damage payments for the rebuilding of Europe after World War One. So it's 6,600 million or 6.6 billion, but it's in pounds. Okay. Germany also had land taken away from it. Now, this included its empire, areas around the world that belonged to Germany. These were now transferred to the League of Nations and called mandates. Okay. They also had areas of Germany itself taken away from them. Okay. Now, choose a few. Know a few of these. All obvious ones are Alsace and Lorraine. Alsace and Lorraine. You could also have the Saarland was put under the control of the League of Nations, and all the coal that was taken from the Saarland was given to France. Okay. Other areas you could have would be Schleswig-Holstein in the north of Germany. Okay. Eupen and Malmedy. Just know a few as examples of the territory that was taken away from Germany. Okay, so Germany felt betrayed by the Weimar Republic. The German people felt as though they'd been betrayed. They felt they didn't deserve this, and it was known as the stab in the back. Okay, it's the stab in the back. Okay. As a result of the Treaty of Versailles, there was massive discontent in Germany. This was compounded by influenza outbreak in 1918, which killed thousands. Okay. a lot of people in Germany blamed communists and Jews for the Treaty of Versailles and the stab in the back. No truth to this, except that some of the high-ranking politicians that were part of the signing of the Treaty of Versailles were Jewish, and a lot of the reason for the end of the war was because of communist discontent on the streets. So communists and Jews were blamed. The government was seen as weak and ineffective, and living conditions were made worse because of the poverty that was a result of the reparations that Germany had to pay. Okay, so massive problems in Germany for years following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. There were riots and rebellions, and that's the next section we need to move on to. Okay, so riots and rebellions. 1919 was was one of the big ones, the first big one, the Spartacist Uprising. This was a communist uprising led by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Okay, spot these guys, you can find them in the revision guide. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. Okay, they led 50,000 workers on a strike, and the government was really stuck as to how to deal with this, because they didn't have much of an army. The army was still in disarray following the end of World War One, and it was a big threat. The Weimar Republic was almost overthrown. In the end, they asked for help from the Freikorps. Now, that's a key word, Freikorps. Ex-German soldiers who also hated communists, and they were like hired thugs, basically. They were walking around with their weapons, and they squashed the Spartacist rebellion. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg were killed. Rosa Luxemburg's body was found in the river Spree, which is the river that runs through Berlin. Karl Liebknecht's body was found in a children's playground. So problem solved, I suppose. A very brutal way of solving it, but the Weimar Republic survived that first attempt on its authority, okay, by using the Freikorps. The second problem came the following year, in 1920. It was the Kapp Putsch. Okay, Putsch is just a posh word for rebellion, or German word for rebellion. The Kapp Putsch, led by Dr. Wolfgang Kapp. Okay, now this was a right-wing rebellion, whereas the Spartacist rebellion was a left-wing rebellion. This was a right-wing rebellion. Okay, the aim was to put the Kaiser back in charge. Okay, so they wanted to overthrow the Weimar Republic and put the Kaiser back in charge. Now, again, the Weimar Republic didn't have much of an army to speak about, and what was worse, the army refused to help. Now, that just proves how weak the Weimar Republic was, if the army can refuse to do as it's told. Okay, so the Weimar Republic had to rely on something else. They couldn't rely on the Freikorps this time, because a lot of the members of the Freikorps were actually part of the rebellion. And that's why the army refused to fight, because they didn't want to fire on ex-soldiers. The army refused to fire on ex-soldiers. What they actually said was the army does not fire on the army. So the government was absolutely stumped. It was very, very close to losing its grip on power. And in the end, it was the workers that saved them. The Weimar Republic asked for the workers to come out on a general strike, and this forced Wolfgang Kapp and his followers to climb down and give up their attempt to overthrow the government. Okay, because if the workers refuse to do what they're doing, then the government can't survive. So Wolfgang Kapp, who'd taken control of Berlin, was forced to run away because the workers refused to do what they were told. Okay, so again, just the Weimar Republic survives. The first attempt, the Spartacist rebellion, they survived by using the Freikorps. The second attempt, the Kapp Putsch, they survived by calling on the workers. That's what you need to know. But you need to be aware that it just underscores how weak the Weimar Republic was, because they couldn't rely on their army. Okay, if a government can't rely on their army, then they are very weak. And then we've got another problem in 1923. It's just how bad it is for the Weimar Republic. It's like one problem after another. By 1923, a couple of years later, Germany couldn't pay its reparations. They just had not got enough money to pay their reparations, and they refused to pay the reparations set out under the Treaty of Versailles. Now, France was still angry. This is only like 4 or 5 years after World War I ended. They're still angry with Germany, and they send in the soldiers. So this is known as the French occupation of the Ruhr, R-U-H-R. Now, they occupied the Ruhr because it was the most productive area of Germany. It's where all the factories and the coal mines were. It's the industrial heart of Germany. So they confiscated iron and coal. This is the French. They confiscated Germany's iron and coal. They thought, if they're not going to pay us the money, we'll take their iron and coal, and that's what they did. Now, the Germans, in retaliation, refused to work, so the German workers went on strike. If the German workers are not going to work, then there's no coal and iron being produced. There's nothing for the French to take. So in retaliation, the French sent in French workers. And you can imagine the tension that was in this place. You've got French soldiers, French workers doing the jobs of the striking German workers. Okay, so unsurprisingly, people were killed. There was violence. There were riots. And it was just a big mess. And France is still not receiving the reparations that they wanted. Okay, to pay the workers who were striking in the Ruhr, what the German government did, stupidly, was just print more money, as if that would solve the problem. This was the worst thing they could have done, because it led to hyperinflation. In other words, the value of the German currency, the mark, went through the floor. Millions and millions of marks were produced, and they weren't worth anything. There's stories of people stealing wheelbarrows and leaving the money behind that the money was being carried in. Okay, so hyperinflation was a big problem. Okay, give you an example. In 1918, an egg cost 1/4 of a mark. By November 1923, one egg cost 80 million marks. That's hyperinflation. Okay, nobody wanted the German mark. It became absolutely useless. Now, people suffered this. The hardest hit were people with savings, particularly pensioners. People who'd saved up all their lives, saved millions of marks, or thousands of marks. Those marks became worthless. So it was a real problem for ordinary people, particularly the middle classes. And you can imagine those people started to think, well, we need a strong government to sort this out. The Weimar Republic can't do it. We need a strong man. And some of these extremist parties, like the one led by Hitler, start to look attractive to these people. Okay. However, it's not all over for the Weimar Republic yet, because enter the saviour, Gustav Stresemann. So we need to look at Gustav Stresemann, and his recovery in 1923, what he does for Germany. These are known as the golden years for Germany, or also known as the Locarno honeymoon. Okay, so very quickly, the things that Stresemann does, you need to be aware of them and why they're important. Stresemann becomes Chancellor in 1923. He ends the strike. He gets the workers back to work. And he starts production moving again. Now, great, but also unpopular with the right wing, because that's like giving in. It was like surrendering to France. Okay, he starts paying reparations again. He starts a new currency called the Rentenmark. Okay. Now, again, for the right wing, this seems like giving up. So Stresemann is incredibly unlucky, incredibly unpopular, but it's the right thing. It gets Germany back on its feet. But he's so unpopular that he's forced out as Chancellor, and he has to become Foreign Minister instead. But he carries on helping Germany as Foreign Minister. He agrees the Dawes Plan in 1924. You need to know the Dawes Plan. It was whereby the German government borrows £40 million from the USA to pay off its debts and get reparations working, and investing in industry to get the country moving again. Okay. He takes this further in 1929 by agreeing the Young Plan, which is borrowing even more money and rearranging the length of time that they have to pay off the reparations. Okay, then reparations are reduced to 1/4 of the amount, and they're given 59 years to pay them off as part of the Young Plan. Okay, also as Foreign Minister, Stresemann signs the Locarno Pact, which is agreeing the borders of Germany, which is important because it means that other countries will trade with Germany if they agree their borders, right? It's making Germany less frightening to other countries. Remember, Germany is very unpopular after World War I. But also, again, the right wing see this as a bad thing. Borrowing money from America is like the worst thing you can do, because the right wing hate America as this decadent capitalist country. But they also don't like signing an agreement that says that the borders can stay as they are. Because remember, the Treaty of Versailles has taken a load of land away from Germany. And Stresemann is basically saying, that's okay, we're all right with that, we don't mind. And the right wing, like Hitler and the nationalists, they don't agree with that. So they don't like the Locarno Pact either. And finally, the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was signed by Stresemann as well in 1928, alongside 65 other countries. That's an agreement to only use the army for defence. And again, this is unpopular with the right wing, who want to take back Germany, make Germany strong again. Okay, so you've got the Dawes Plan, the Young Plan, the Locarno Pact, the League of Nations. Germany joins the League of Nations, by the way, in 1926, and the Kellogg-Briand Pact. You need to know those, and you also need to know how Stresemann gets the workers back to work in the Ruhr, ending the French occupation, ending hyperinflation by introducing the new currency, the Rentenmark, and fixes Germany. Okay, this is the German recovery. Okay, so Germany had begun to recover, but remember, it all depends on US money. It all depends on that loan from America, that £40 million loan. Stresemann unfortunately died just before the Wall Street crash in October 1929, and then that's when America calls in all its debts, demands the money back, and that's when the bottom falls out of the German economy for the second time in 1929, okay? We'll park that because that's leading on to the early stages of the Nazi Party. Just very quickly, the last thing I want to do, just for a couple of minutes, is look at other changes under the Weimar Republic. First of all, living standards, how they improved for the working classes. During the golden years, Stresemann's golden years after 1923, living standards did improve. This was the boom time, the 1920s boom time. This is like... people are driving around in cars, they're enjoying life, they're able to afford luxuries, okay? The working class became more prosperous. Unemployment insurance and benefits for workers who are unemployed. New houses, more than 2 million new homes are built, which also creates jobs for workers, okay? So these are great times for ordinary people. The changes mainly help the working classes, not the middle classes. So again, those middle classes who were upset at losing all their savings in the 1923 hyperinflation crisis, they're still looking for someone who's going to stick up for them. And to Hitler's very keen on helping the middle classes because he knows that they've got a little bit more clout, a little bit more money. So park that for now, but that's one of the problems. The working class benefit, but not so much the middle class. Women gained more freedoms, okay? Women were allowed to dress as they wanted, go out without chaperones, something they'd never been allowed to do before World War One. They wear makeup, they smoke, they have jobs that men have. It's a great time for equality, great steps towards equality between the sexes, okay? More opportunities. 112 women are elected to the Reichstag, okay? So there's 112 women in politics. So the traditional role of women begins to change. Divorce becomes easier, so there's a lot more rights, a lot more human rights for women, okay? And as we will see, that ends when Hitler takes power in 1933, 1934. But for women and the working classes, the golden years of the Weimar Republic are a great time. Finally, cultural achievements. The Weimar Republic was a period of great cultural achievements. We've got things like the Bauhaus movement in art, School of Design, the dramas of Bertolt Brecht, German cinema. Fritz Lang is a famous German director who made a famous film called Metropolis. Frankfurt University becomes a real centre of learning. So the Weimar golden years, this period between 1923 to 1929, is a really big step forward. Economically, culturally, socially for women. It's a big boom time, but the bottom all falls out of it in 1929 with the Wall Street crash, okay? And that's where we're going to leave it because the next revision session will be on the early stages of the Nazi Party. So it's the same time frame, the same years from 1919 up to 1933, but it's what Hitler was doing in that time, okay? Because remember, at this point, Hitler is unknown. Nobody knows who Hitler is. He's just a nobody. He was a soldier in World War One, okay, up until the Wall Street crash, and then he starts to become a little bit more famous. So the next revision session is all about the early stages of the Nazi Party from 1919 onwards, okay?